Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. We talk a lot about curriculum, instruction, assessment, and we really try to spend a lot of time, and a theme throughout many of our episodes is really around how to have students doing the heavy cognitive lift in their classrooms. How do we have students doing the thinking? Earlier on, we had Alice Vigors on talking about her book, Thinking Classrooms, but that was really looking at thinking classrooms in a global sense. Tonight, I'm really excited. We actually have two guests talking about thinking classrooms. First, let me present our guest, and then I'm going to present our guest host, which is a first for the Have a Life Teaching podcast. Our guest is Peter Liljedahl. He is a professor at Simon Fraser University and the author of Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics, 14 Teaching Practices for Enhancing Learning. No one better to really talk about what a thinking classroom in math looks like. We're also being joined by my colleague at Brooklyn College. He is the student teaching supervisor of our program and an expert on college teaching in his own right, and that is Dr. Norman Eng, who is joining Dr. Peter Liljedahl, and he is the author, Dr. Eng that is, of Teaching College, the Ultimate Guide to Lecturing, Presenting, and Engaging Students. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me, co-host. Appreciate it.
And Norman, on that note, take it away.
Peter, thank you so much for being here. Your book, Building Thinking Classrooms, focuses on 14 practices that optimize thinking. And these 14 practices, which I'm sure we'll cover at least in part today, make classrooms look very different than what we typically see, at least in many math classrooms. I wanted to ask you first, how did thinking classrooms become an area of interest? In other words, what kind of drew you to this work? And then I'd love for you to go into talk a little bit about the 14 practices.
Given the time we have, I'm not going to get very far into the 14 practices, but I will tell you what inspired it. I'm a former high school math teacher. I taught in the Vancouver School District, west coast of Canada, and I taught math. I also taught physics and English composition, but my heart's with mathematics. And like many teachers in Canada, I ended up doing my master's degree while I was a classroom teacher. And towards the end of my master's, I got recruited into a PhD program and I took an education leave, always with the intention of going back into the classroom. Destiny intervened and here I am. But nonetheless, it was during this education leave when I realized just how much I missed the classroom. And I wanted to get back into classrooms and spend some time really observing student learning. I wanted to get behind the facade of student behavior. One of the things that I became acutely aware of as a teacher is that what the students choose for me to see in their learning behavior is exactly that. It's what they choose for me to see. There are other behaviors that I became keenly aware that I was not privy to. And I wanted to kind of get behind that facade, the facade of student learning, and really understand what their lived experience was in the classroom. So I wanted to spend time in classrooms, not teaching. I wanted to be a fly on the wall. I reached out to my network of colleagues and friends, and I asked them to recommend to me teachers that they had heard were good, and they did. And then I would email those teachers and I would say, hey, so-and-so says you're a good teacher. Can I come and spend some time in your classroom? And when you send an email like that, they almost always say yes. And when I was in those classrooms, I would ask them to recommend to me teachers that they had heard were good, and so on and so forth. So I kind of was able to stitch together this journey into 40 different classrooms in 40 different schools. Because I was following this thread of good teacher, I saw a lot of diversity. Like sometimes I was in kindergarten classroom, sometimes I was in AP calculus classroom, sometimes I was in private schools, public schools, low socioeconomic, high socioeconomic, inner city, urban, rural, French, English. I saw a lot of diversity. And yet everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. I saw students not thinking. And that's a problem. Because if students are not thinking, they're not learning. I wanted to document this in some way. I wanted to actually gather evidence of this. I wanted to answer two questions. Is it in fact true that students are not thinking? That was my sense, but could I conduct an empirical study that would verify this? And if they're not thinking, then what is it that they're doing? I dove back into many of these classrooms and spent intense amounts of time trying to answer these two questions. I was watching kids, I was listening to kids, I was talking to kids. I was really observing and documenting their behaviors and trying to understand what it was that was going on. What is this that I'm seeing, and can I name it? After several months of intense study, the data revealed that by and large, my sense had been correct, that in fact, 80% of students spent their entire lesson not doing any thinking whatsoever. 20% were thinking, but then again, only for 20% of the time. Not to say they wouldn't think for longer. It's just that's sort of what the teachers gave them time to do. And again, this is not to say that these kids weren't busy. They were busy. The teachers kept them moving. They had them doing stuff. They were worksheets, they manipulatives, they were filling things in. They were taking a ton of notes. Oh my goodness, there was a lot of note taking. There was always stuff that they had to do. But it turns out that much of what they were being asked to do wasn't actually requiring them. What is it that they're doing? Well, they're stalling, slacking, faking. But by and large, what they're doing is they're mimicking. Mimicking is where, let me just show you how to do it. Now you do it. Do it 3 times, do it 10 times. And then there's some homework. I categorize mimicking as not learning just because of the way the students were actually talking about it and the way they were approaching it, and the way that their behaviors were revealing that this indeed wasn't a thinking behavior. It turned out that it wasn't even a learning behavior. It was more of a production behavior. Mimicking is what students are doing in order to produce for you the things that you want in exchange for praise, gold stars, and grades. You asked, what was the impetus? That was the impetus right there. It was this realization that a large number of our students are not thinking. Thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. But then that was coupled with other realizations, chief among which was much of what the way classrooms look and much of what happens in classrooms today is largely unchanged from classrooms 150 years ago. And what this speaks to is that you talk about classroom norms, the norms that teachers establish among their students and so on and so forth. But things that I was seeing, these behaviors that I was seeing in the students, the practices I was seeing in the teachers, they transcend classroom norms. These were institutional norms. These were norms that were robust, had transcended time, and that were just so infused into the very fabric of school that we don't even question their existence. These are default settings on what it means to teach and what it means to be a classroom and what it means to be a school. And I started to wonder if everywhere I go, I see these institutionally normative structures, and everywhere I go, I see students not thinking. Could these be connected? And if they are connected, it means we're going to have to break norms to get students to think. And that was the basis of the research. Can we get more students thinking? Can we get them thinking for longer?
Absolutely. Based on your research, you found some very eye-opening things. These led to these macro moves, these 14 practices. I'd love if you could tell us in general about what these 14 practices are about. Give us a concrete example that might include some sort of thinking task. And I'm particularly interested in elementary. John and I both teach in the childhood education program in our college, but a lot of the classrooms, a lot of these tasks are conversion tasks. I'm wondering, how would a building thinking classroom in an elementary class might look like? Of course, if you want to bring an example for secondary, no problem.
First of all, when I started this research, I recruited hundreds of teachers to work with me. Our mandate was simple: break norms, see if we can get students to think. And the sort of interesting thing that came out of that was that everything stuck. As long as we were breaking norms, we were getting students to think. That the norms, in fact, are holding back student thinking. But then from a research perspective, I was losing track of the data because we were trying 5 things at a time. We were seeing changes, but we couldn't attribute any one student behavior to any one teacher action. That sort of robust data that way. So I reorganized the research into 14 variables. And the 14 variables are sort of the core routines that every teacher does. So every teacher uses tasks. We know that some tasks are better at getting students to think than others. My question was, what are the best tasks for getting students to think? We all use group work to some extent. Every teacher does that. Does how we group students actually affect the way they think? Turns out the answer is yes. We all answer questions. Does that make a difference? Guess what? Yes, it does. We all have students write notes and do homework, and we do summative and formative assessment. We do all these things. These are some of these normative routines that we do. And by and large, we do them in ways that converge to this sort of societal, cultural, educational norm, these institutionally normative structures. But these became my variables around which I did my experimentation. So what were some of the results from this? Well, it turns out that what is the best type of task? The best type of task is a thinking task. A task is inert. A task in and of itself is not a thinking task. It's just a task. It's how that task intersects with those learners and their current learning that makes it a thinking task or not. And a lot of that has to do with what the teacher does. If I sit them down and I show them how to do it, then this task is not a thinking task. It's a mimicking task because I've shown them how to do it. But if I ask them to think about something that they haven't seen before, it becomes a good thinking task. For example, trying to figure out what's greater, 17 or 18, is an amazing thinking task for a kindergarten student, not so much for a grade 9 student, because it intersects with their lived experience at a different point of their learning cycle. It turns out that every task can be a thinking task, and every task can be a not thinking task, depending on how we use it, when we use it, what we do to prep the students for it, and so on. Let's talk about the groups. Our research showed that when we group students strategically, we want to differentiate, so I'll make ability groups, or I want to increase productivity, so I'll make mixed ability groups. Maybe I just want peace and quiet, so I'm going to keep certain students apart, and so on. This is called strategic grouping. When we make strategic grouping, it actually suppresses thinking in the classroom. Likewise, when we let students pick their own groups, it suppresses thinking, and ironically, for the same reason as a strategic grouping. It turns out that both of those types of grouping predetermine for students what their role is going to be. And then they live down to that expectation. Because for 75% of students, their role is not to lead. It's not to think. It's just to follow. So what turned out to be the optimal way to group students for maximum thinking? Random. Except random wasn't good enough. It had to be visibly random. The students had to know it was random, and it had to be frequent, about every 60 minutes. The other place that had a really big impact was where we have students work. So where do we get students to work? Well, normally in their desks, in a notebook or on paper, on a worksheet. Our data actually showed that that was the worst place to have students work in their collaborative groups when they were thinking. The best place, vertical whiteboards. Having the students stand in their random groups of 3 at vertical whiteboards. And there was some really interesting reasons why that turned out to be the best, but it was the magnitude of improvement. When we started doing this and we were using thinking tasks and random groups and vertical surfaces using vertical whiteboards, we went from 20% of students thinking for 20% of the time to 80% of students thinking for 80% of the time. There were these shocking big differences. How should we arrange the furniture? Randomly scattered about in defronted manner. What's the best way to give a task? It turns out it was verbally, with the students on their feet close to us, standing with us in a huddle. What was the best way to do homework? Drop the word and the verbiage of homework completely and shift this from an accountability practice to a responsibility practice, and having students do it because they want to do it, not because they have to do it. And there were some very particular ways that that had to be structured. There were all of these really surprising, and you call them macro moves. So what does a lesson look like in an elementary classroom? If we're doing something that's curricular, it always starts with the kids on their feet with me standing at the whiteboard or around a table, but usually at the whiteboard. And I ask them some very simple questions just to activate prior knowledge. I may show them something that they need to know for the lesson, but I don't mean that as prerequisite knowledge, something small that maybe they need to know, or maybe we need to review. And then I ask them their first question, and then randomize them, and off they go. First question, the kids are usually looking at me sideways, like, are you serious? This is too easy. So for example, maybe we're adding fractions. So this is a lesson I did recently with kids. So they're adding fractions. So the first fraction they're adding is 1/5 plus 2/5. But then comes the next question, and it's a little harder. And by the end of the lesson, they're adding questions like 3 and 5/7 plus 4 and 6/11. And they're doing this at the boards in their groups. And they've been at the boards now for about 2/3 of the lesson, working on this sequence of tasks. They don't get them all at once. They're getting the questions one at a time. And when they are successful with a question, they get the next one. They have one marker that they're sharing at the whiteboards. There's a ton of collaboration and conversation. This marker's moving between the students. They're self-checking. They're checking in with neighbors to make sure that what the next task is. If they get stuck, they might be talking to another group to see if they can get unstuck. The whole time, the teacher is active. The teacher is on their feet, moving around. They're constantly giving hints, extensions. They're teaching into spaces where students are struggling. They're supporting, scaffolding. They're doing all the things that good teaching is, except they're doing it in a distributed way. They're placing that effort where it's needed, not for everybody. We're leaving room for other groups to think, and so on and so forth.
So you're saying that instead of what the teacher could be doing, which is, for example, they're lecturing, doing a mini lesson, trying to get students to understand how to, let's just say their goal for the day was to try to get them to add fractions with unlike denominators. Instead of doing that, the teacher is leading them through tasks, sequential tasks that go from easy to hard, eventually leading to understanding how to add fractions with unlike denominators. It replaces that lecture, but
Right.
students are doing the actual work.
Yep. So they're doing that cognitive lift, as John mentioned earlier. They're doing the thinking, but it's a very carefully sequenced set of tasks so that they learn something from question 1 that helps them do question 2, and they learn something from question 2 that helps them do question 3, and so on and so forth. But is it without flaw? No, they're going to hit hiccups. They're going to get stuck. They're going to get frustrated. When they start to get frustrated, the teacher's there giving them what they need to push them forward just in time, as Julie Dixon says, just in time to move them to the next stage. But that differentiated support, not assuming that everybody can't do it, but placing that support where students really are struggling and then leaving the students who are capable to forward, and so on and so forth, so that everyone is always thinking. Everyone is in that productive struggle. They're all thinking, they're working their way forward. They're meaning making. It's messy. At about a 2/3 point of the lesson, the teacher will bring them all back together at a whiteboard, and we'll basically go through a consolidation activity where what the teacher is trying to do is get them to notice and name variation of tasks. There'll be 3 questions on the board of 3 different difficulty level, but they're out of order. First one is not the easiest one. And the first prompt is that the teacher will say, here, I put up 3 questions that are very similar to the ones you just did, but I may have put them in the wrong order. What order should they be in and why? And then the kids do a turn and talk, and they're talking. So this is the first opportunity they actually have to see multiple questions at the same time. They're able to notice and name variation and invariance here. They're noticing, well, the third question should be first because it's a common denominator. And the first question should be second because they're not common denominator, but they're friendly. One denominator is 5 and the other one's 10. It's really easy to convert that. And then the middle one is the hardest because the denominators are very different. We're going to have to do some work on that. Tell us that. They tell me that as a teacher that's the order they should be in. And then we work through them together in a plenary setting, and not me giving a lecture, but me asking probing questions. So what is something I can do here? Someone will say, well, add the numbers on top. Okay, so add the numerators. What about the denominators? No, don't add the denominators. Why not? And they'll talk about that. And can someone explain to me how we can see that that's why we don't add the denominator? And someone will tell us to draw a pie chart or a rectangle or something. They'll show us and how we're adding fifth and then more fifth, and so on and so forth. And we'll move to the second question. What do we have to do here? And well, we got to convert the 1/5 to 2/10. Well, how can we do that? So I'm asking probing questions. They're giving me what they need. I'm only acting as a scribe in terms of what gets written on the board. But of course, I'm controlling the narrative through the questions I'm asking, but it's the questions I'm asking, not the things that I'm saying. I'm asking them to articulate and justify, and so on and so forth. Eventually, we get to a point where we've gone through all these. And this is a very common type of consolidation when we have what we call a convergent task. And a convergent task is a task where pretty much every group did it the same way, which is different from a divergent task. A divergent task, every group does it a different way. And when we have divergent tasks, we do gallery walks. But when we have convergent tasks, we kind of do this teacher scribe. And we gather and we talk and we go through this and then make some notes. And we're definitely going to do some check your understanding questions. But what I really want to do is come back to these 3 routines, and they're all part of the closing routine, the closing the lesson. So I said that 2/3 of the lesson are kind of at the whiteboards on their own in their groups and with teacher support. But now we're in that closing where the teacher is closing off the lesson. And what is the purpose of this? It's not to just summarize. We go back to the whiteboard work. What are they doing there? They're meaning making. That's what's happening in their groups. They're meaning making. Meaning making is messy. It's chaotic. It's unorganized. It's unstructured. It's informal. They're spitballing, they're trying stuff, it's messy, but they're making meaning. They're starting to make meaning. They need to get messy in order for this to work. But their thoughts haven't yet turned into meaning made. They're still chaotic. They haven't organized, structured, and formalized their thoughts yet. And if we let them walk out of the room with this sort of chaotic ideas, they're more likely to float away. So what the closing of a lesson does through the consolidation, through the meaningful notes, through the check your understanding questions, is all about helping them turn meaning making into meaning made. It's helping them clean up the mess, and by helping them organize, structure, and formalize their thinking. We're giving vocabulary, we're displaying routines through the way we scribe, we're giving them opportunities to check their understanding. We're going through this process because it's important. And it's so important that we dedicate about a third of the lesson to it. But this is a third of the lesson that comes at the back end, not the front end. There isn't a lecture at the front end. The notes aren't at the front end. The Now You Try One isn't at the front end. All of this is at the back end, after they've had a chance to make a mess, to make some meaning.
Thanks for painting this picture. I think one of the hardest things that any teacher who's reading your book or who's thought about building a thinking classroom, they want to have that concrete idea of, is this possible in my classroom? And one way for them to realize this or understand this is for you to paint that picture in a thinking classroom. Thanks for that. We're in a post-COVID stage of learning, being back in the classroom. But I wonder how the thinking classroom and these 14 practices might translate into an online classroom.
Yeah. You're familiar with the orange book, the first book, Building Thinking Classrooms. There's a blue one as well, called Modifying the Thinking Classrooms for Different Environments. Modifying a thinking classroom is, how do we take these ideas that were all developed in bricks and mortar places with desks and whiteboards in classrooms with bell schedules, real classrooms? How do we take these ideas and how do they translate to atypical learning environments? So what are some of the atypical learning environments? Well, online is an atypical learning environment, and it comes in different flavors. There's asynchronous and asynchronous. There might be some hybrid learning environments. Those are also synchronous and asynchronous. What does it look like if we're teaching in sort of a resource room or adult upgrading setting? Multiple students in the room, but they're all working on their own learning plan. What does it look like if we're working with small groups where we're working on unfinished learning? What does it look like in a small class? It turns out a classroom behaves very differently when there's less than 15 students. It actually makes a difference. What if we're homeschooling? What are all these different settings? And that book is about how to translate these ideas into those spaces. But in your particular case, what does it look like in an online setting? And I'm going to assume you mean a synchronous online setting. There's a chapter on that. Yeah, there's some very good ways to almost completely emulate the things I just described, but through an online setting. It requires a synchronization between a communication software like Zoom, like we're using right now, some place where we can talk to each other and see each other, a program that we can actually use to make random groups like Zoom, so that we can create those random breakout groups. It also needs a digital whiteboard that acts as a proxy, but you also need what I call a knowledge feed. In a building thinking classroom in a physical space, one of the most common things we see students do is turn their head and they look around and they look at that board over there and they look at that board over there. But what they're doing is they're going, hey, we got the same answer. I think we're on the right track. Or they got something different. We better check our work. That passive ability to extract knowledge out of the space around us is hard to do in digital environments. So the knowledge feed is a window that's supposed to be open on their screen that is streaming some knowledge. Maybe I'm taking a picture of a board and I'm posting it there. It's a hint that's appearing. Maybe it's a clarification that's streaming. Oh, here's an extension question. This idea that out of the corner of their eye, they can see something. Oh, yeah, we may want to try that. So a really good way for me to communicate with all the groups at once. So these things working in concert with each other, we're able to actually emulate almost all of what happens in a thinking classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that the same ideas of randomizing students in groups of 3 would translate. Putting them in a breakout room, the equivalent of having 3 students standing on a vertical whiteboard. But I can see how a lot of it can be approximated through Zoom. Glad that there's some work on this because, of course, increasingly we're seeing so much more of this online component. So both John and I teach free service teachers. And one of the things that we want to know is how we might incorporate the building thinking classroom practices into our teacher prep programs, especially when we prepare our students to go into the classrooms that often follow, as you kind of referred to, kind of that I do, we do, you do, that mimicking model.
Me, like you, I teach pre-service teachers. They live and breathe building thinking classrooms all the way through their course. Before I talk about how I do that, I do want to talk a little bit about the last thing you said. How do we prepare them to go into a classroom where the sponsor teacher does a lot of I do, we do, you do? I'm very fortunate at my university. The student teachers are required to enact very particular things by their faculty associates. So when they're out on practicum, they can't just go in and do what the classroom teacher does. They have to enact some of the things that they've learned at the university. And part of becoming a sponsor teacher is accepting the fact that, yes, this student is going to have to come in and they're going to have to do things that you don't do. The fact that they're going into a classroom where maybe the teacher doesn't do this isn't a barrier to them being allowed to do it, because they have to do that in order to become certified. If they need support from that, then the university is going to support the student. They don't have to do it every day, but there's going to have to be a portion of this practicum where they enact some of the things that they've learned at the university. I don't know if you have that same structure, but I'm very fortunate to have that structure.
It is hard, especially with the test-taking years in New York State. Many teachers resist that. And especially when you're student teaching in the spring semester, when state testing tends to happen. But of course, you go back to the idea of, you agree to this. Maybe this is part of the contract or the memo of understanding that you have between the partner schools.
But the other thing for me personally, and I always tell my student teachers this, is that I'm not teaching you how to be a teacher in your practicum. I'm teaching you how to be a teacher for when you have your own classroom. And when you have this autonomy, a lot of the assignments we do and a lot of the activities we do are meant to teach them how to be a teacher, but not just that, but preserve their ideas on how to be a teacher, so that once they have their classroom, they can go back to some of those artifacts and recall the learning that they have done. But getting back to the first question, what does a lesson look like? I immerse them in a building thinking classroom experience. Every session that we're together starts with them being immersed as learners into one of these lessons. We don't start off with a whole full pull where we're going to launch, do the whole body and all the closing activities. First, we're just going to go play at the whiteboards and do some non-curricular tasks. Later on, we'll go and we'll do some curricular tasks, but we're not going to focus in on the closing. That'll come later in the semester. I'm immersing them. I'm dipping them into the experience, and then I'm pulling them out. And then we're having that conversation. What did you notice? What did you notice about your experience as a learner? What did you notice about me as a teacher? And it's the prompts in that debrief that are so vital. What are things I could have done to make your experience worse? Nothing I do is arbitrary. Do you have any questions for me? How was what I did now the same or different from what I did earlier? Creating comparative experiences, doing a little bit of shock and awe, where maybe I'll teach part of a lesson in that sort of institutional normative way. We'll take a break and then I'll do very similar content, but I'm going to push them into a building thinking classroom experience. It's always this shift of attention, and I'm pushing their role back and forth, pushing them in as a learner, pulling them out as a teacher, and I'm asking them to notice learning. As the semester goes on, they get better and better at noticing. And then they start asking the questions about, why did you do that? And what about this? And what if I have a student who's like this? How does this fit there? And so they're having this constant, immersive, reflective experience.
And so you're saying your pre-service teachers, they're also being asked to incorporate some aspects of the building thinking classroom in their practicum as well?
So the way our structure at our university is that they're in modules, and it's a cohort. Let's say 40 teachers in a cohort. They have assigned to them 2 faculty associates. These are seconded teachers who are going to guide them through 12 months of this program. 4 months of the program, they're taking methods courses with people like me. So I'm not the one who's in the classrooms observing them. I'm giving them that method experience. Their faculty associates are the ones who are with them in the classroom. A lot of these faculty associates are using ideas of building thinking classrooms as part of their immersive experience in those modules. Their faculty associate may not say specifically, do building thinking classrooms, but they may say, okay, you got to show me a lesson that is student-centered, that requires the students to enter into a state of productive struggle. They might talk about growth mindset. They may say, there's certain things that we want to see you try. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but we want to see you make these efforts. But if they've had a methods course with me, they might go, I have some ideas on how to do that. Even if all we can do is give them a positive experience inside of that methods course, if they don't apply it in their clinic practicum, at least they have that they can take with them into their own classroom.
Yeah, that mimicking model is not the only way to do things, and getting them to think differently could just be a game changer.
The other benefit is if we give them this alternate experience, They also have a much more critical lens through which they can observe and analyze the teaching they see during their practicum, so that they're not going out there and going, oh yeah, this is great, this is what I'm going to do. They might actually go out there and go, this is not good. I don't want to do this. I want to do this. That's sort of an inoculation in a way.
Is there anything else that our audience should know?
I'm holding up for the camera the new book. It's Tasks for the Thinking Classrooms, K-5, and it's basically 50 full lesson plans, but not lesson plans in the sense of just do this. It's you still have to be really critically active in that space and make decisions, but it gives teachers a lot of resources for how to launch a thinking classrooms in a K-5 classroom.
Gentlemen, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Well, if you want to find out about me, you can Google Peter Liljedahl. You'll bump into a couple of websites. But if you want to know about the work, go to buildingthinkingclassrooms.com. Brand new website. You can go to Twitter at PG Liljedahl or at BTC Thinks. But my favorite place to go is Facebook. So you go to Facebook, under groups, search Building Thinking Classrooms. There's over 40 groups dedicated to building thinking classrooms. The biggest one has over 60,000 teachers in it. There are highly specialized ones. There's K-2 ones. There's 3-5. There's ones that are linked to particular curriculum like CPM and illustrative. There's a Danish one, if that floats your boat. Each one of them is created by, monitored, and supported by communities of teachers who are meaning-making around building thinking classrooms.
I am a part of a couple of the Facebook groups, so very much aware of it. I definitely invite our listeners to tune into some of those groups to see what day-to-day conversations are happening about building thinking classrooms. As for me, you can find out more about me from my website, normaneng.org. My background is not just childhood education, but also higher ed instruction.
Thank you both, gentlemen. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks
so much.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.